The envelope sat on my nightstand for 3 days before I finally sealed it. Inside was a letter that would change everything, not just for my children, but for me. You see, when your own family abandons you in a place that smells like disinfectant and broken dreams, you discover things about yourself you never knew existed. Some people call it revenge. I call it justice. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't anger. It's the truth, written in your own hand, waiting to be discovered when it's already too late to undo the damage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Henderson, though most folks have called me Dot for the better part of 75 years. 3 months ago, I was living in the same house on Elm Street where I'd raised my children, Bobby and Patty, where I'd planted roses every spring for 47 years, and where my late husband Frank had built a tire swing that still hung from the old oak tree in our backyard. 3 months ago, I thought I knew what family meant. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in September. I was in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd packed thousands of school lunches and bandaged countless scraped knees when Bobby walked in without knocking. He'd been doing that a lot lately, treating my home like it was already his property. His face wore that expression I'd learned to dread, the one that meant he'd been talking to his sister again, making decisions about my life without including me in the discussion. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, settling his considerable frame into one of my dinette chairs. At 48, Bobby had inherited his father's broad shoulders, but none of his gentle nature. Where Frank had been thoughtful and patient, Bobby was impulsive and self-serving. He worked as a regional manager for a trucking company, made decent money, and never let anyone forget it. I poured myself a cup of coffee, noting how he didn't ask for one. "What's on your mind, Bobby?" "It's about your living situation." He gestured around the kitchen as if it were somehow inadequate. "Patty and I have been talking, and we think it's time you considered other options." Other options. The phrase made my stomach clench. What kind of other options? "There's a really nice place called Maplewood Care Center. We drove by it last weekend, and it's beautiful. They have activities, medical staff on site, people your own age to socialize with." His voice carried that forced enthusiasm people use when they're trying to sell you something you don't want. I set my coffee cup down carefully, my hands suddenly feeling unsteady. "You want to put me in a nursing home." "It's not a nursing home, Mom. It's a senior living community, and we're not putting you anywhere. We're suggesting you might be happier there, safer there." He leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "You're 75 years old. What if you fall down those stairs? What if you have a medical emergency and nobody's around to help?" The irony wasn't lost on me. Bobby lived 20 minutes away, but visited maybe twice a month. Patty lived even closer, but was always too busy with her own family to stop by more than once a week, and then only for brief, obligatory visits that felt more like welfare checks than genuine concern. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I could hear the defensiveness in my voice. "I've been managing just fine since your father passed." "Have you?" Bobby's tone sharpened. "Mrs. Thompson called Patty last week. She said she found you in your front yard at 11 o'clock at night, looking confused." "Carol Thompson?" My busybody neighbor who seemed to find great pleasure in monitoring my every move. I wasn't confused. I thought I heard something and I went to investigate. It turned out to be a raccoon getting into the garbage. "At 11 at night? In your nightgown?" Heat flushed my cheeks. It was a robe, not a nightgown. And since when is it a crime to check on strange noises around your own property? Bobby sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Look, Mom, I know this is hard to hear, but we're worried about you. Patty's been saying for months that you seem different, more forgetful, more isolated. Different how? I challenged, though part of me already knew what he was going to say. You forgot Tommy's birthday last month. You've lived in this neighborhood for 47 years, but last week you got lost coming home from the grocery store and had to call Patty for directions. And when was the last time you had a real conversation with anyone besides us? Each observation hit like a small blow to my pride. Yes, I'd missed Tommy's 16th birthday, but I'd been dealing with a terrible headache that day. Yes, I'd taken a wrong turn coming home from Kroger, but the construction on Main Street had confused me. And as for conversations, well, most of my friends had either moved away to be closer to their own children or had passed away entirely. Those are just minor things, I protested. Everyone forgets things sometimes. Everyone gets turned around. Occasionally. Mom. Bobby's voice grew gentler, which somehow made it worse. Dr. Martinez thinks it might be early signs of dementia. The word hung in the air between us like a diagnosis I wasn't ready to accept. Dr. Martinez, my physician for the past 15 years, had mentioned during my last visit that I seemed a bit more confused than usual, but I'd attributed it to stress from missing Frank so desperately. Dr. Martinez never said anything about dementia to me. Because you asked him not to discuss your medical information with us, remember? But Patty was with you at that appointment, and she heard what he said about cognitive screening. I did remember asking for privacy regarding my medical care, mostly because I was tired of Bobby and Patty treating me like a child who couldn't be trusted with her own health decisions. But I didn't remember Patty being at that appointment, which was troubling in itself. Even if there were some minor cognitive changes, I said carefully, that doesn't mean I need to be warehoused in some institution. It's not warehousing, Mom. These places are designed specifically for people who need a little extra support. They have medication management, regular meals, social activities. You'd have your own apartment, your own space, but with help available whenever you need it. The way he described it made it sound almost appealing, which made me suspicious. In my experience, when something sounded too good to be true, it usually was. And what about this house? What about my things, my memories? Bobby glanced around the kitchen, and I caught something in his expression that made my heart sink. Well, obviously, we'd need to sell the house. The cost of care at Maplewood is pretty significant, and your Social Security and Dad's pension won't cover it entirely. There it was, the real reason behind this sudden concern for my welfare. The house on Elm Street, purchased for $12,000 in 1976, was now worth nearly $400,000 thanks to the neighborhood's gentrification. With Frank's life insurance policy and our savings, plus the equity in the kid's house, I was sitting on a substantial nest egg that would make Bobby and Patty's inheritance quite comfortable. I see. I kept my voice neutral, though inside I felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. And I suppose you and Patty have already looked into the costs at this Maplewood place? We've done some preliminary research, yes. We wanted to have all the information before we talked to you about it. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. The thing is, Mom, even with selling the house, it's going to be expensive. But we think it's worth it for your safety and your peace of mind, I thought, but didn't say. How convenient that their peace of mind aligned so perfectly with accessing my assets. When would this move need to happen? I asked, still maintaining that careful neutrality. Well, they have a waiting list, but there's actually an opening. Coming up in December. If we put down a deposit now, you could move in right after Thanksgiving. Right after Thanksgiving, before Christmas. Before the holiday that had always been the most important one in our family, the one where we'd gathered in this very kitchen for 47 years, where Frank had carved the turkey and I'd made his mother's stuffing recipe, where Bobby and Patty had torn open presents under the tree in the living room. That's very soon, I managed. I know it seems fast, but good spots at places like Maplewood don't stay available long. And honestly, Mom, Patty and I both think the sooner the better. Winter's coming, and you know how icy these sidewalks get. What if you slip and fall? What if you have a stroke or a heart attack and you're here all alone? What if? What if? What if? Every terrible possibility designed to make me afraid of the life I'd been living perfectly successfully until they decided it was inconvenient for them. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Bobby's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, but don't take too long, okay? Like I said, good spots don't wait. After he left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, looking around at the space that had been the heart of my family for nearly 5 decades. The small ding in the cabinet door where 6-year-old Patty had thrown a wooden spoon during a tantrum. The pencil marks on the doorframe where we'd measured Bobby's height every year until he turned 18. The window over the sink where I'd watched both my children learn to ride their bikes in the driveway. This wasn't just a house. It was the repository of my entire adult life. The place where I'd transformed from a young bride into a wife, a mother, a widow. The thought of leaving it, of having strangers walk through these rooms and decide they wanted to paint over my memories, made me feel physically sick. But Bobby's words echoed in my mind. What if I was becoming forgetful? What if I was a danger to myself? What if my children's concerns were legitimate and I was being stubborn and selfish by refusing to acknowledge them? That evening, Patty called. My daughter had always been the more diplomatic of my 2 children, the one who smoothed over Bobby's bluntness with carefully chosen words and gentle persuasion. At 45, she was a successful real estate agent with 2 teenagers of her own, a beautiful colonial house in the best part of Springfield, and a husband who adored her. She was everything I'd hoped she'd become when she was a little girl playing house in the backyard. Hi, Mom. Bobby said he talked to you today about Maplewood. He did. I didn't volunteer anything more, curious to see how she'd approach the subject. I know it must have been a lot to process. Change is never easy, especially at our age. She paused, and I could hear the careful calculation in her silence. David and I actually drove by there yesterday, just to see what it looked like from the outside. It's really beautiful, Mom. The grounds are gorgeous, and they have this lovely courtyard with benches and flower gardens. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's nice, I said non-committally. The thing is, Mom, I've been worried about you for a while now. Not just the forgetfulness, but you seem so lonely. When was the last time you did something just for fun? When was the last time you had a real conversation with someone your own age? It was a fair question, and one I didn't have a good answer for. Since Frank's death 18 months ago, my social circle had shrunk considerably. The couples we'd been friends with didn't quite know what to do with a widow, and the few single friends I'd had were dealing with their own health issues or family obligations. I talked to people at the grocery store, I said weakly. That's not the same thing, and you know it. Patty's voice carried genuine concern, which made it harder to dismiss her arguments. At Maplewood, you'd be around people who understand what you're going through. People who've lost spouses, who know what it's like to feel adrift after decades of marriage. I'm not adrift, I protested, though even as I said it, I wondered if it was true. Maybe that's the wrong word, but Mom, you have to admit that your world has gotten a lot smaller since Dad died. You used to be so social, so involved in things. Remember when you volunteered at the library? When you organized the neighborhood block parties? When was the last time you did anything like that? She was right, and I hated that she was right. I had withdrawn from most of my activities after Frank's funeral, partly because everything reminded me of him and partly because I couldn't summon the energy to pretend I was okay when I wasn't. People grieve differently, I said. Just because I haven't felt like socializing doesn't mean there's something wrong with me. I know that, Mom. I'm not saying there's something wrong with you. I'm saying maybe this could be an opportunity for something right. A chance to start fresh, to meet new people, to have support when you need it. The way both my children talked about Maplewood, it sounded like a resort rather than an institution. But I'd visited enough of these places over the years to know the reality was usually quite different from the marketing brochures. "Have you actually been inside this place?" I asked. "Have you talked to any of the residents?" "We have an appointment next week to tour the facilities and meet with the administrator. Would you like to come with us?" The question caught me off guard. I'd expected them to present me with a fait accompli, not actually involve me in the decision-making process. "I suppose I could do that," I said carefully. "Great. I'll pick you up on Thursday at 10. And Mom, I know this is scary, but I really think you might be surprised by how nice it is. Tommy's friend's grandmother lives there, and she loves it. She says it's the best decision she ever made." After we hung up, I found myself wondering if my children were right. Maybe I was being stubborn and prideful. Maybe moving to a place like Maplewood would be good for me. Maybe I was holding on to this house and this life out of fear rather than genuine preference. Over the next few days, I tried to imagine what my life would look like in a senior living community. Scheduled meals in a communal dining room, organized activities led by enthusiastic young staff members, a smaller living space with only my most essential belongings, no yard to maintain, no house to clean, no responsibility for anything beyond showing up and existing. Part of me found the idea appealing. I was tired of rattling around in this big house by myself, tired of making decisions about maintenance and repairs, tired of the isolation that had become my constant companion since Frank's death. Maybe Bobby and Patty were offering me a gift, rather than a sentence. But another part of me rebelled against the idea of giving up my independence, my autonomy, my right to live in my own home for as long as I was able. This house wasn't just where I lived, it was who I was. Every room held memories I wasn't ready to pack away. Every corner reminded me of the life Frank and I had built together. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I waited for Patty to pick me up. I'd dressed carefully in my best slacks, and the navy cardigan Frank had always said brought out my eyes, wanting to look competent and alert rather than like someone who needed institutional care. Patty arrived precisely at 10, looking polished and professional in her real estate agent uniform of pressed khakis and a crisp white blouse. She kissed my cheek and complimented my outfit, her manner bright and encouraging. "You look lovely, Mom. Are you ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, though I wasn't sure that was saying much. The drive to Maplewood Care Center took us through parts of Springfield I rarely visited anymore, past the new shopping complex that had replaced the downtown, area where Frank and I used to walk on Saturday evenings, past the elementary school where Bobby and Patty had learned to read and write. Everything looked different now, newer and somehow less substantial than I remembered. Maplewood itself was impressive from the outside, a sprawling complex of brick buildings surrounded by well-maintained landscaping and discreet signage that made it look more like a corporate campus than a nursing home. Patty had been right about the grounds. They were genuinely beautiful, with mature trees and carefully planned flower beds that would probably be stunning in spring. We were met at the front entrance by Mr. Franklin, the administrator, a man in his 50s with the kind of practiced warmth that comes from years of selling difficult decisions to reluctant families. He wore an expensive suit and had the soft handshake of someone who'd never done physical labor in his life. "Mrs. Henderson, so wonderful to meet you. I'm Jim Franklin, and I'm delighted to show you around today. I think you're going to be very impressed with what we have to offer here at Maplewood." The tour began in the lobby, which was decorated like an upscale hotel with comfortable seating areas, fresh flowers, and soft classical music playing from hidden speakers. Residents moved through the space at various speeds, some walking confidently, others using walkers or wheelchairs, all of them looking clean and reasonably well cared for. "This is our main gathering area," Mr. Franklin explained, gesturing toward the seating arrangements. Residents often meet here for coffee in the morning or to play cards in the afternoon. We find that having these informal social spaces really helps people form friendships. We moved through the dining room, which looked like a restaurant with round tables covered in white cloths and fresh flower centerpieces. The menu posted by the entrance featured surprisingly sophisticated options: herb-crusted salmon, chicken, marsala, vegetarian pasta primavera. Our executive chef comes from the hospitality industry, Mr. Franklin noted with obvious pride. We believe good food is essential to quality of life, so we've made dining a priority here at Maplewood. The activities room was buzzing with a water aerobics class for residents with mobility issues. The participants, mostly women in their 70s and 80s, moved slowly through the pool while an instructor offered gentle encouragement. They looked engaged and happy, chatting with each other as they exercised. We have a full calendar of activities, Mr. Franklin continued, handing me a printed schedule. Exercise classes, book clubs, movie nights, musical performances, guest lectures. There's really something for everyone. The apartment we toured was larger than I'd expected, with a living room, bedroom, kitchenette, and full bathroom. The furnishings were bland but comfortable, and the large windows offered a pleasant view of the courtyard Patty had mentioned. Residents can bring their own furniture and personal belongings to make the space feel like home, Mr. Franklin assured me. We encourage that. This is your home, not just a place you're staying temporarily. Throughout the tour, I found myself looking for signs of the institutional neglect I'd expected. Residents ignored by staff, unpleasant odors, evidence of poor care. But everything seemed clean and well-managed. The staff members we encountered were friendly and attentive, calling residents by name and engaging in brief conversations that seemed genuine rather than performative. By the time we returned to Mr. Franklin's office to discuss practical matters, I was confused by my own reaction. Maplewood wasn't the grim warehouse I'd imagined. It was actually quite nice, and I could see how someone might be happy there. Now let's talk about the financial aspects, Mr. Franklin said, settling behind his desk with a folder full of paperwork. The monthly fee for the type of apartment you toured is $4,800, which includes meals, housekeeping, basic maintenance, and access to all our amenities and activities. $4,800 a month, nearly $60,000 a year. My Social Security and Frank's pension combined brought in about $3,600 monthly, which meant I'd need to come up with an additional $1,200 every month to cover the shortfall. That would require us to liquidate some assets, Patty said diplomatically. Of course, that's very common, Mr. Franklin replied smoothly. Most of our residents find that selling their previous home provides the additional funds needed to maintain their lifestyle here. And really, when you consider that the monthly fee includes housing, utilities, meals, housekeeping, and activities, it's quite reasonable. Reasonable if you had the assets to cover it, and I did, barely, if we sold the house and managed my investments carefully. But it would mean spending nearly every penny I had on my own care, leaving nothing for emergencies and nothing to pass on to Bobby and Patty when I died. How soon would you need a decision? I asked. We have one apartment becoming available, on December 15th. If you'd like to reserve it, we'd need a deposit of $5,000 by the end of next week. December 15th, 3 weeks away, 10 days before Christmas. Could I have a few days to think about it? Of course. This is a big decision, and we want you to feel completely comfortable with your choice. But I should mention that we do have a waiting list, so if you decide this isn't right for you, we'll need to let the next family know as soon as possible. On the drive home, Patty was quietly encouraging. What did you think, Mom? I know it's a lot to process, but it seemed really nice, didn't it? It did, I admitted. Much nicer than I expected. The residents we saw looked happy, didn't they? And the staff seemed genuinely caring. They did. And you have to admit, Mom, the apartment was lovely. You could bring Dad's chair and your dining room table and some of your books. It would feel like home in no time. Some of my books, Dad's chair, my dining room table. A tiny fraction of the possessions that had accumulated over 47 years of marriage. 47 years of making a home together. What would happen to everything else? I asked quietly. Patty's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Well, we'd keep the things that were important to you, of course. Family photos, Dad's watch, your jewelry, and Bobby and I would each take some pieces that have sentimental value. But honestly, Mom, most of it would probably need to be donated or sold. Most of it. The china cabinet Frank had surprised me with for our 10th anniversary. The quilt his mother had made for our wedding. The kitchen table where we'd eaten every meal for decades. Where Bobby had done his homework and Patty had planned her wedding. Most of it would be donated or sold to strangers who would never know the stories behind each carefully chosen piece. I understand, I said, though I wasn't sure I did. That evening, I walked through my house with new eyes, trying to imagine which pieces would be worth keeping and which would be discarded. The exercise was more painful than I'd anticipated. Every item seemed connected to a memory. Every room echoed with conversations and celebrations, and ordinary moments that had made up the texture of my life. In the living room, the couch where I'd nursed both my babies and where Frank had fallen, asleep watching television every Sunday afternoon for 20 years. In the kitchen, the rolling pin that had belonged to my grandmother and the cast-iron skillet that had cooked thousands of family meals. In the bedroom, the dresser where Frank had kept his cufflinks and where I still stored the love letters he'd written me during our brief courtship. How do you choose which parts of your life are worth saving? How do you decide which memories deserve preservation and which can be sacrificed for the sake of practicality? I found myself thinking about the residents I'd seen at Maplewood, wondering what they'd left behind when they made the transition. Had they felt this same mixture of loss and relief? Had they grieved for their former homes while trying to embrace their new circumstances? By the weekend, I'd made my decision, though I wasn't entirely sure how I'd arrived at it. Maybe it was the realization that staying in this house alone was becoming more difficult than I wanted to admit. Maybe it was the fear that Bobby and Patty were right about my increasing forgetfulness and isolation. Maybe it was simply the recognition that fighting against the inevitable was exhausting, and I was tired of being exhausted. On Sunday evening, I called both my children and told them I was ready to move forward with Maplewood. The relief in their voices was palpable, though they tried to hide it behind expressions of pride and encouragement. "I think you're making a really brave choice, Mom," Patty said. "Change is never easy, but sometimes it leads us to exactly where we need to be." "We'll help you with everything," Bobby promised. "The packing, the sorting, the moving arrangements. You won't have to handle any of it alone." Their willingness to help with the practical aspects of dismantling my life should have been comforting, but instead, it felt vaguely ominous. They were very eager to assist with the process of separating me from my possessions and my independence. Over the next 2 weeks, my house was transformed into a staging area for my new life. Bobby hired a company to conduct an estate sale for the furniture and household items we wouldn't be keeping. Patty brought boxes and tissue paper to pack the belongings I'd be taking to Maplewood. Professional movers came to assess the logistics of the transition. The strangers who came to preview items for the estate sale wandered through my home with calculating eyes, picking up pieces of my life and discussing their monetary value in voices that carried clearly through the thin walls. I heard a woman in my bedroom dismissing Frank's dresser as nothing special, and a man in the kitchen wondering if anyone would want such an old refrigerator. Nothing special. 47 years of marriage, and the furniture we'd chosen together was nothing special. I began spending most of my time in my bedroom, the one room that hadn't been invaded by strangers and real estate professionals and adult children making decisions about my future. From my window, I could see the tire swing Frank had built for Bobby when he was 6 years old, still hanging from the oak tree, though both the tire and the rope showed signs of weathering. Bobby had mentioned that the new owners would probably want to remove the swing, along with the garden shed Frank had constructed and the small greenhouse where I'd started seedlings every spring for 4 decades. They'd want to put their own stamp on the property, make it reflect their tastes and their family's needs. Soon, another family would live in these rooms, sleep in these bedrooms, cook meals in this kitchen. Their children would learn to walk on these floors and grow up with completely different memories of this space. The house would continue existing, but everything that had made it mine would be erased. On December 10th, 5 days before my scheduled move to Maplewood, I sat down at my kitchen table with a pen and a sheet of paper. For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet. No strangers evaluating my possessions, no children making arrangements, no professionals measuring furniture. Just me and the silence I'd grown accustomed to since Frank's death. I began to write. The letter I started that evening remained unfinished for 3 days. Each time I sat down to continue writing, something interrupted me. Bobby calling to discuss moving logistics, Patty stopping by with more boxes, or the estate sale company needing decisions about pricing. It was as if the universe was conspiring to prevent me from putting my thoughts into words, though I couldn't have explained at the time why the letter felt so important. Moving day was scheduled for December 15th, and the house had taken on the hollow feeling of a place already abandoned. Most of my furniture was tagged for the estate sale, and my personal belongings were sorted into 3 categories: items going to Maplewood, items being distributed between Bobby and Patty, and items being donated to charity. The last category was by far the largest. I found myself wandering through rooms that no longer felt like mine, touching surfaces that would soon belong to strangers. The realtor had already placed a sold sign in the front yard, though the closing wouldn't happen until after I'd vacated. The new owners were a young couple with 2 small children, and they'd expressed delight at the mature landscaping and the vintage charm of the original hardwood floors. Vintage charm. What they saw as quaint period details, I remembered as brand new installations that Frank and I had saved months to afford. The hardwood floors had been laid the summer Bobby turned 8, and I could still recall the sawdust that had coated everything for weeks, and the pride in Frank's voice when he'd declared them the finest floors in the neighborhood. On December 12th, 3 days before my scheduled departure, Mrs. Park from next door knocked on my front door. Evelyn Park was 82 years old and had been my neighbor for nearly 30 years, ever since she and her late husband moved to Elm Street from Korea. She was one of the few people who still visited regularly, though her own mobility had decreased significantly since her husband's death 2 years ago. "Dorothy," she said when I opened the door, her accent still thick despite decades in America. "I heard you moving to nursing home. Is true?" I invited her in, noting how carefully she navigated the front steps with her walking stick. "It's called a senior living community, and yes, I'm moving there on Friday." Mrs. Park settled into one of the few remaining chairs in my living room, her sharp eyes taking in the boxes and empty spaces. "Why you do this? You not sick. You not need nursing home." Her directness was refreshing after weeks of careful euphemisms from my children. "Bobby and Patty think it would be safer for me. They worry about me living alone." Ha! Mrs. Park's expression conveyed her opinion of my children's concerns. "Bobby and Patty worry about themselves, not about you. You live here 47 years. This your home. Why you let them take from you?" "They're not taking it from me," I protested, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "It's my decision." Mrs. Park studied me with the penetrating gaze that had always made me slightly uncomfortable. She'd raised 4 children largely on her own while her husband worked 2 jobs, and she had no patience for self-deception or weakness. "Is your decision, or is their decision you think is your decision?" The question hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. Over the past month, I'd found myself adopting Bobby and Patty's language about the move, describing it as an opportunity rather than a loss, a new beginning rather than an ending. But sitting across from Mrs. Park, I realized how much I'd been trying to convince myself as much as anyone else. "The place is very nice," I said weakly. "They have activities and social opportunities. I'll be around people my own age." "People? Your age in boxes, waiting to die." Mrs. Park's bluntness was jarring, but not inaccurate. "You want activities? We make activities. You want social? I still here. Mrs. Thompson's still here. Mr. Martinez still here. Why you need strangers when you have neighbors?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding asking myself. The truth was that my relationships with my remaining neighbors had become increasingly superficial since Frank's death. We exchanged pleasantries over the fence and helped each other with small favors, but the deeper connections had withered, along with my confidence and energy. "It's more complicated than that," I said. "Bobby and Patty think I'm not managing as well as I used to. They're concerned about my memory, about my safety." Mrs. Park made a dismissive sound. "You forget sometimes? So what? I forget too. Last week I put milk in cupboard, cereal in refrigerator. You think my children put me in home? No. They help me remember. They visit more, call more. They don't throw me away because I'm getting old." Her words stung, because they highlighted the difference between her children's response to her aging and my children's response to mine. Mrs. Park's daughter lived across town and visited twice a week. Her son called every Sunday from California and flew in for every birthday and holiday. They saw her increasing forgetfulness as a reason to provide more support, not less autonomy. "Maybe your children are different?" I said, hearing the defensiveness in my voice. "Maybe your children want your house," Mrs. Park replied with characteristic directness. "How much they get when you sell?" The question I'd been avoiding asking myself was suddenly spoken aloud by someone who had no reason to soften the truth. How much would Bobby and Patty inherit if I spent down my assets paying for care at Maplewood versus how much they'd inherit if I continued living in my own home with minimal expenses? The difference was substantial. If I lived another 10 years at Maplewood, virtually every penny I owned would go to paying the monthly fees. If I stayed in my house, even with the costs of occasional help and home maintenance, the majority of my assets would remain intact. "I don't want to think my children would," I began, but Mrs. Park cut me off. "You don't want to think, but maybe you should think. You good woman, Dorothy? You good mother? You deserve better than this." After she left, I found myself unable to concentrate on the packing tasks that still needed completion. Her words had planted a seed of doubt that grew larger the more I considered the financial implications of my decision. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my old friend Margaret Walsh, who'd moved to Arizona 3 years ago to be closer to her grandchildren. Margaret and I had been close friends for over 20 years, before geography and the demands of caring for aging parents had caused us to drift apart. "Dorothy! What a wonderful surprise!" Margaret's voice carried genuine warmth across the phone lines. "How are you, dear? How are you managing without Frank?" Her question was the first time in months that someone had asked about my emotional state rather than my physical capabilities or living arrangements. The simple kindness of it nearly brought me to tears. "I'm struggling a bit," I admitted. "Actually, I'm calling because I could use some advice from someone who's been through this." I told her about Bobby and Patty's concerns, about the tour of Maplewood, about the decision to sell the house and move to the senior living community. Margaret listened without interrupting, making occasional sounds of understanding or sympathy. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Oh, Dorothy, I'm so sorry you're going through this. It sounds incredibly difficult." "Bobby and Patty think it's for the best," I said, repeating the phrase I'd been using like a mantra. "And the facility really is very nice." I'm sure it is. But honey, can I ask you something? Do you want to move there? The question was so simple and direct that it caught me off guard. In all the discussions and planning and preparations, no one had asked what I actually wanted. I don't know, I said honestly. I'm scared of being alone, scared of something happening to me, and no one knowing. But I'm also scared of giving up my independence, of losing everything that makes me feel like myself. Those are both valid fears, Margaret said gently. When Tom and I moved down here, it was our choice. We wanted to be closer to the kids, and we wanted the security of a retirement community. But it was what we wanted, not what someone else thought was best for us. How do you know if you're making the right decision? Margaret was quiet for a moment. I think you know you're making the right decision when it feels like you're moving toward something you want, rather than away from something you're afraid of. Does this move feel like moving toward something good, or does it feel like running, away from something scary? Her question crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate. The move to Maplewood felt entirely reactive, a response to Bobby and Patty's fears about my safety and competence, rather than a positive choice about how I wanted to live. It feels like running away, I admitted. Then maybe you need to think more carefully about whether it's really the right choice for you. After we hung up, I sat in my darkened living room surrounded by boxes and half-empty shelves, trying to remember the last time I'd made a major decision based on what I wanted, rather than what other people thought was best for me. Even marrying Frank, though I'd loved him dearly, had been heavily influenced by my parents' approval and the social expectations of my generation. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. I called Bobby and asked him to come over so we could talk. He arrived within an hour, looking slightly harried. What's going on, Mom? We're supposed to start loading the truck tomorrow. Please tell me you're not having second thoughts. I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Bobby's expression grew wary. Okay. If I stayed in this house and hired someone to help me with grocery shopping and housework, would that address your concerns about my safety? Mom, we've been through this. Living alone at your age isn't safe, regardless of how much help you hire. That's not what I asked. I asked if having help would address your safety concerns. Bobby ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was trying to avoid answering a direct question. It might help with some of the day-to-day stuff, but it wouldn't address the bigger issues. What if you fall in the middle of the night? What if you have a stroke or a heart attack? What if your memory problems get worse? What if I have a stroke at Maplewood? What if I fall there? What if my memory problems get worse in an institutional setting where I have no control over my environment? That's different. There's medical staff available 24 hours a day. There are safety systems in place. And there are also strangers making decisions about my daily routine, my meals, my activities. There's no privacy, no autonomy, no connection to the life I've built over 7 decades. Bobby's patience was clearly wearing thin. Mom, I don't understand what's changed. You agreed to this move. We've already put down the deposit, signed the contracts, arranged everything. The new owners of this house are planning to move in after the holidays. What changed is that I realized no one ever asked me what I actually wanted. Everyone asked what I thought about Maplewood, what I thought about the financial arrangements, what I thought about the timeline. But no one asked if this was how I wanted to spend whatever years I have left. This is how you want to spend them? Alone in a house that's too big for you? Isolated from people your own age, struggling with tasks that are becoming more difficult every day? His words were meant to sound caring, but I heard the underlying frustration. The moving truck was reserved, the deposits were paid, the contracts were signed. My sudden attack of independence was inconvenient. Maybe, I said, maybe I'd rather struggle in my own home than be comfortable in someone else's. Bobby stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. The careful patience he'd been maintaining gave way to something harder and more calculating. "Mom, you can't back out now. We've spent thousands of dollars on this move. The estate sale is scheduled for this weekend. The house sale will fall through if you're still living here." "You've spent thousands of dollars? I thought I was paying for all of this." "You are, but Patty and I have invested time and money in making these arrangements. We've taken time off work, hired services, made commitments. You can't just change your mind at the last minute because you're having some kind of senior moment." Senior moment. The phrase hit like a slap, revealing exactly how my son viewed my sudden assertion of autonomy. "I see," I said quietly. "So my concerns about this decision are just confusion caused by my failing mental faculties." Bobby had the grace to look embarrassed. "That's not what I meant." "I think it's exactly what you meant. I think you and Patty have convinced yourselves that I'm incompetent so you don't have to feel guilty about pressuring me into a decision that serves your interests more than mine." "That's not true, Mom. Everything we've done has been for your benefit." "Has it? Or has it been for the benefit of inheriting a house that's already been sold and assets that won't be depleted by years of care expenses?" The accusation hung in the air between us, too serious to be taken back and too accurate to be easily dismissed. Bobby's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought he might deny it entirely. Instead, he stood up abruptly. "I think you're confused and upset, and we should table this conversation until you've had time to calm down. Patty and I will be here tomorrow morning to start the moving process as planned." "And if I refuse to go?" Bobby paused at the front door, his hand on the knob. "You won't refuse, Mom. Because deep down, you know we're right about this. And because you love us too much to put us through the stress and expense of undoing all these arrangements." After he left, I realized that my son had just revealed the true dynamic of our relationship. My love for my children was being used as leverage to ensure my compliance with their decisions. They were counting on my maternal instincts to override my personal preferences, just as they'd been doing for months. That afternoon, Patty called to check on my state of mind after Bobby's visit. "He's worried about you, Mom. He said you seemed confused about the moving arrangements." "I'm not confused, Patty. I'm reconsidering." "Reconsidering what?" "Mom, it's too late to reconsider. Everything is arranged. Maplewood is expecting you on Friday." "Then I suppose someone will need to call them and explain that I've changed my mind." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. When Patty spoke again, her voice had lost its carefully maintained patience. "Mom, you cannot do this to us. Do you have any idea how much work we've put into making this transition as smooth as possible for you? Do you know how many favors we've called in, how many arrangements we've made?" "I didn't ask you to make those arrangements. You agreed to them. You toured the facility. You signed the paperwork. You told us to move forward. We've been operating in good faith based on your consent. And now I'm withdrawing that consent." "You can't just withdraw consent when people have relied on your word and made commitments based on your decisions. That's not how the adult world works, Mom." "The adult world." As if I were a child who needed instruction in responsibility and consequences. "I'm 75 years old, Patty. I've been making decisions and living with their consequences since before you were born. I think I understand how the adult world works." "Then act like it," she snapped, her composure finally cracking entirely. "Stop being selfish and think about how your actions affect other people." Selfish. The word my daughter used to describe my desire to remain in my own home, to maintain some control over my own life, to resist being warehoused in an institution because it was convenient for my children. "I'll talk to you later, Patty," I said, and hung up before she could respond. That evening, I finished the letter I'd started 4 days earlier. The words came easily now, flowing from a clarity I hadn't felt in months. When I was done, I folded the pages carefully and placed them in an envelope, which I sealed and addressed in my best handwriting. Then I called a taxi and asked the driver to take me to the post office. Christmas Eve morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that makes everything look dreary. I sat in my new room at Maplewood Care Center, watching raindrops trace patterns down the window while trying to summon enthusiasm for the holiday festivities planned by the activities staff. The past 9 days had passed in a blur of institutional routines and well-meaning attempts at socialization. I'd attended the welcome orientation, participated in the getting-to-know-you sessions, and dutifully showed up for scheduled meals in the communal dining room. Everyone was very kind, very professional, very determined to help me adjust to my new life. But adjustment was proving more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The apartment I'd been assigned was indeed lovely, just as Patty had promised. The living area was spacious enough for my favorite chair and a small selection of books, and the bedroom accommodated my dresser and the photographs I'd chosen to bring. The kitchenette was adequate for making coffee and storing the occasional snack, though all major meals were taken in the main dining room according to the schedule. What nobody had prepared me for was the suffocating sameness of institutional life. Breakfast at 8, activities at 10, lunch at noon, rest period until 3, afternoon programming until 5, dinner at 6, evening entertainment until 8. Every day structured, every hour accounted for, every meal planned by someone else. I understood the logic behind the schedule. Many of the residents thrived on routine and needed the structure to navigate their days successfully. But after 47 years of setting my own pace, making my own choices about when to eat and what to do with my time, the rigid scheduling felt like a straitjacket. The other residents were pleasant enough, though forming genuine friendships proved challenging. Most conversations centered around health problems, children who visited too infrequently, and memories of lives that felt increasingly distant from current reality. Everyone was polite and cordial, but there was an underlying sadness that permeated even the most cheerful interactions. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived across the hall, had been at Maplewood for 3 years and had appointed herself my unofficial guide to the social dynamics of the community. "You'll get used to it, honey," she assured me over breakfast on my 5th day. "The first month is always the hardest. After that, you start to appreciate not having to worry about cooking and cleaning and all those household chores." "Do you miss your own home?" I asked, genuinely curious about her experience. Mrs. Rodriguez paused with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "Every single day," she said quietly. "But my daughter lives in Seattle, and my son travels for work. They couldn't help me anymore, and I couldn't manage alone. This was the best option available." The best option available. Not the option she wanted, but the option that remained after all the preferred alternatives had been eliminated by circumstances beyond her control. Over the course of my first week, I heard variations of that same story from a dozen different residents. They'd come to Maplewood not because they wanted to be there, but because their families had determined it was the safest, most practical solution to the problem of aging parents who could no longer be easily managed at a distance. Mr. Chen, a retired professor who'd sold his home in San Francisco, told me his children visited once a month and called once a week, which was more than many residents could claim. "They're good kids," he said during our conversation in the library. "They just have their own lives to live. I understand that." Understanding and accepting seemed to be the prevailing attitudes. Among my fellow residents, they understood that their children were busy. They accepted that moving to institutional care was necessary. They appreciated the safety and services provided by Maplewood. But underneath the understanding and acceptance, I sensed a profound loneliness that no amount of organized activities could address. The activities themselves were well-intentioned, but often felt patronizing. Chair exercises led by an enthusiastic young woman who spoke to us as if we were kindergartners. craft projects that produced items no one actually wanted, musical performances by local school groups whose members looked uncomfortable and eager to leave. Book club was marginally better, though the selections were chosen by staff members who seemed to believe that people over 70 could only handle romance novels and inspirational memoirs. When I suggested we read something more challenging, the activities director smiled indulgently and explained that they tried to choose books that wouldn't be too demanding for residents. Too demanding. As if a lifetime of reading and thinking had suddenly evaporated the moment I walked through Maplewood's doors. The most painful part of my new life was the visits from Bobby and Patty. They came twice during my first week, both times arriving with bright smiles and forced enthusiasm about my adjustment process. "You look great, Mom," Patty exclaimed. During their first visit, surveying my small apartment with obvious relief. "This place is even nicer than I remembered, and you've made it so cozy with your personal touches." Bobby nodded approvingly at the arrangement of furniture and photographs. "We told you this would be good for you. Look how well you're settling in." They spoke as if my presence at Maplewood was evidence of their wise decision-making rather than the result of pressure and manipulation. They asked about the food, the activities, the other residents, but they never asked how I felt about being there or whether I was happy with the choice I'd been encouraged to make. During their second visit, they brought my 7-year-old granddaughter, Katie, who seemed fascinated by the institutional environment. "Is this like a hotel, Grandma?" she asked, examining the bathroom fixtures and testing the buttons that summoned help. "Something like that," I replied, not wanting to burden her with the complexities of my situation. "Are you on vacation here?" The innocent question hit harder than any of the well-meaning comments from staff or other residents. Out of the mouths of babes. Katie had instinctively understood that Maplewood felt temporary, like a place you visited rather than a place you lived. "Not exactly a vacation," I said carefully. "I live here now." Katie absorbed this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance of childhood. "When are you going to come home?" Bobby quickly intervened. "Grandma's home is here now, sweetheart. This is where she lives." "But what about her real house, the one with the tire swing?" "Grandma doesn't live there anymore. Some other people live there now." Katie looked confused by this explanation, as if the concept of adults choosing to leave their homes was too foreign to comprehend. She was right to be confused. It was foreign, at least when the choice wasn't entirely voluntary. As Christmas approached, the staff at Maplewood went into overdrive with holiday programming. The lobby was decorated with an enormous tree and an elaborate nativity scene. Christmas carols played constantly in the common areas. Special holiday meals were planned, and families were encouraged to join their loved ones for Christmas dinner in the main dining room. Bobby and Patty dutifully signed up to attend Christmas dinner with me, along with their spouses and children. The prospect of celebrating Christmas in an institutional dining room, surrounded by other families going through the motions of holiday tradition, filled me with a sadness I couldn't shake. This would be my first Christmas without Frank. My first Christmas away from the house where we'd celebrated 46 previous Christmases together. Instead of waking up in my own bed and cooking breakfast in my own kitchen, I'd wake up in a room that still felt foreign and eat breakfast prepared by institutional cooks in a dining room filled with strangers. On December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, I received an unexpected phone call from Mrs. Park. "Dorothy, how you doing in that place?" she asked without preamble. "I'm adjusting," I said automatically, the response I'd been giving to everyone who asked. "That not what I ask. I ask how you doing." Her directness cut through my diplomatic evasions. "I'm miserable, Evelyn. I hate it here." "Why you hate?" "It's not my home. It's not my life. I feel like I'm playing a role in someone else's story." "Then why you stay?" The question was so simple it took my breath away. Why was I staying? What was keeping me? In a place that made me unhappy, Living a life that felt fundamentally wrong? I don't know, I admitted. Bobby and Patty worked so hard to arrange everything. The house is sold. My old life is gone. Old life not gone unless you let it be gone. You still Dorothy Henderson. You still smart woman who can make own decisions. You don't have to stay in box just because someone else put you there. After we hung up, I sat in my sterile apartment thinking about Mrs. Park's words. Why was I staying? What was I afraid would happen if I left? The practical obstacles seemed overwhelming. I had no home to return to, and finding new housing at my age with my resources seemed nearly impossible. I'd already spent the deposit and first month's fees at Maplewood, and breaking the contract would involve financial penalties I couldn't easily afford. But underneath the practical concerns was something deeper. The fear that leaving would prove Bobby and Patty right about my incompetence and poor judgment. If I couldn't make this transition work, if I couldn't adapt to the life they'd chosen for me, what did that say about my mental faculties and my ability to make sound decisions? The answer, I realized, was that it said I was a human being with preferences and needs that couldn't be met by institutional care, regardless of how well-intentioned and professionally managed it might be. There was nothing wrong with my judgment. There was something wrong with a system that measured success by compliance rather than happiness. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since arriving at Maplewood. I called a taxi and asked the driver to take me to my old neighborhood. The ride through Springfield felt like traveling through a museum of my former life. We passed the grocery store where I'd shopped for decades, the bank where Frank and I had gotten our first mortgage, the park where Bobby and Patty had learned to ride their bikes. Everything looked the same, but I felt like a ghost visiting, scenes from someone else's past. When we reached Elm Street, I asked the driver to park across from my former house. The new owners had already made changes. Different curtains in the windows, a new mailbox, a Christmas wreath on the front door that was nothing like the simple evergreen arrangements I'd made every year. But the bones of the house were the same. The oak tree with Frank's tire swing, the front porch where we'd sat on summer evenings, the bay window in the living room where I'd placed our Christmas tree every year since 1976. Sitting in the taxi, looking at the house that had been my home for 47 years, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't nostalgia or regret. This was recognition. I recognized myself in that house, in that life, in a way I hadn't recognized myself since walking through Maplewood's doors. "You okay, lady?" the taxi driver asked, noticing my tears. "I'm fine," I said, and for the first time in weeks, I meant it. I'm ready to go back now. But I wasn't ready to go back to Maplewood. I was ready to go back to being Dorothy Henderson, the woman who'd raised 2 children and buried a husband and managed her own life for 75 years. The woman who deserved better than institutional care just because it was convenient for other people. That night, I called Margaret in Arizona. "I need help," I said when she answered. "I made a terrible mistake, and I don't know how to fix it." "Tell me what's wrong, honey." I told her about my 9 days at Maplewood, about the suffocating routine and the profound loneliness and the growing certainty that I'd allowed myself to be bullied into a decision that served everyone's interests except my own. I want to leave, but I don't know how. I don't have anywhere to go, and Bobby and Patty will think I've lost my mind completely. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Dorothy, do you remember what you told me when Tom was dying, when I was so afraid of being alone that I could barely function?" I did remember. Margaret had been terrified of facing widowhood, convinced she couldn't manage without her husband's guidance and support. "I told you that you were stronger than you knew, and that you'd figure out how to build a life that worked for you." "That's right. And you were right. I did figure it out, but only after I stopped listening to everyone else's opinions about what I should do and started listening to my own instincts. This is different, Margaret. I don't have the resources I had a month ago. I've burned bridges I can't rebuild." "Have you? Or have you just discovered that some bridges weren't worth maintaining? Her question reframed everything I'd been thinking about my situation. Maybe the problem wasn't that I'd made irreversible mistakes. Maybe the problem was that I'd been trying to preserve relationships and arrangements that were fundamentally harmful to my well-being. What would you do if you were me? I asked. I'd ask myself what Dorothy Henderson wants to do with whatever time she has left. Not what her children want. Not what's most convenient. Not what's most financially prudent. What does Dorothy want? What did I want? The question seemed almost revolutionary after months of deferring to other people's judgments about my needs and capabilities. I wanted to wake up in a place that felt like home, even if it wasn't the specific house I'd lost. I wanted to make my own decisions about how to spend my days, even if some of those decisions turned out to be mistakes. I wanted relationships based on mutual respect rather than management of my presumed incompetence. Most of all, I wanted to stop being afraid of disappointing people who'd already demonstrated that my happiness was less important to them than their own convenience. I want to leave here, I said. I want to find a place where I can live on my own terms, even if those terms aren't perfect. Then that's what you should do. But how? I have nowhere to go and I can't afford to maintain two living situations while I figure out alternatives. Where's the letter you mentioned writing before you moved? I'd told Margaret about the letter during one of our earlier conversations, though I hadn't explained its contents. I mailed it to Bobby and Patty with instructions that it should only be opened if something happened to me. What kind of something? If I died, or if I became unable to make my own decisions. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Dorothy, what did you write in that letter? The truth, I said simply. Everything I'd been too polite or too afraid to say while I was trying to preserve family harmony. And what was the truth? I took a deep breath, remembering the words I'd poured onto paper during those final days in my house. That I knew they were more interested in my assets than my well-being. That I understood their decision to pressure me into institutional care was motivated by their inheritance concerns rather than genuine worry about my safety. That I'd spent my entire adult life putting their needs ahead of my own, and I was tired of being taken for granted. Did you tell them how you really felt about being forced to leave your home? I told them everything. How betrayed I felt, how angry I was, how much I resented being treated like an incompetent child. I told them that if they wanted me out of their lives badly enough to warehouse me in a nursing home, then they'd succeeded completely. Margaret was silent for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Margaret, are you still there? I'm here. I'm just thinking about what a powerful piece of truth-telling that letter must be. It doesn't matter now. It's just sitting in their mail, waiting for me to die before anyone reads it. Is it? Or is it sitting there waiting for you to decide that you're ready to deliver its message while you're still alive to benefit from it? The idea had never occurred to me. The letter had been written as a final statement, a posthumous revelation that would force Bobby and Patty to confront the consequences of their treatment of me. But Margaret was suggesting something entirely different, using the letter as a tool for reclaiming my life rather than simply documenting my grievances. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe it's time for Bobby and Patty to read that letter. Maybe it's time for them to understand what they've done and what it's cost you. And maybe it's time for you to stop protecting them from the truth about how their actions have affected you. The thought of voluntarily revealing the contents of that letter while I was still alive to face the consequences terrified me. But it also excited me in a way I hadn't felt since before Frank's death. What would happen if I stopped being the accommodating mother who absorbed criticism and went along with decisions that served other people's interests? What would happen if I demanded to be treated with the respect and consideration I'd been giving other people my entire adult life? I don't know if I'm brave enough to do that, I admitted. "You're brave enough," Margaret said with certainty. "You've been brave your whole life. You just haven't been brave for yourself." Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brittle sunshine that makes everything look sharp-edged and unforgiving. I woke early in my narrow bed at Maplewood, listening to the sounds of institutional life beginning its daily cycle, staff members arriving for their shifts, breakfast preparations in the kitchen down the hall, the mechanical hum of heating systems working overtime against the December chill. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what Christmas morning would have been like in my old house. I would have risen at my own pace, made coffee in my own kitchen, and sat in my favorite chair by the bay window to watch the neighborhood children trying out their new bicycles and skateboards. Frank and I had always opened our gifts to each other before Bobby and Patty arrived with their families, savoring the quiet intimacy of the early morning hours. Instead, I was facing a day of scheduled festivities designed to manufacture holiday cheer for people who'd been separated from their real lives and the places where their authentic memories had been made. The decision I'd reached during my conversation with Margaret 3 nights earlier had been growing stronger rather than weaker as Christmas approached. By the time I'd finished my institutional breakfast and returned to my room to prepare for my family's visit, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I dressed carefully in the navy dress I'd worn to Frank's funeral, the one that made me look dignified and serious. Then I called the front desk and asked them to contact Bobby and Patty with a message that I needed to see them privately before the planned Christmas dinner. Something in my tone must have conveyed urgency, because within an hour, both my children were sitting in the small visiting area adjacent to my room, their faces showing concern mixed with the barely concealed impatience of people whose holiday plans had been disrupted. "What's wrong, Mom?" Patty asked, settling into one of the uncomfortable institutional chairs. "Are you feeling okay? Is there a problem with your medication?" Her first assumption was that my request for a private meeting indicated some kind of medical or mental health crisis. The possibility that I might simply have something important to discuss apparently didn't occur to her. "I'm fine physically," I said, taking the seat across from them. "But there's something we need to talk about before we go through the motions of a family Christmas celebration." Bobby checked his watch, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was impatient to get through unpleasant conversations. "Okay, but we can't take too long. David and the kids are waiting in the car, and we promised them we'd get to dinner on time." "This won't take long," I said, reaching into my purse and withdrawing an envelope. "But it's important." The envelope was addressed to both of them in my careful handwriting, with instructions that it should only be opened in the event of my death or incapacitation. I'd retrieved it from their mailbox the previous evening during another taxi ride through my old neighborhood, using the spare key they'd forgotten I still possessed. "What's that?" Patty asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew. "It's a letter I wrote just before moving here. A letter you were supposed to read after I died." I set the envelope on the small table between us. "But I've decided you should read it now, while I'm still alive to have this conversation." Bobby and Patty exchanged glances, and I saw a flash of something that might have been fear pass between them. "Mom, if this is some kind of dramatic gesture because you're feeling emotional about the holidays," Bobby began, but I cut him off. "Read it." My tone brooked no argument, and after a moment's hesitation, Patty reached for the envelope. Her hands shook slightly as she tore it open and unfolded the 3 pages I'd written during those final days in my house. I watched their faces as they read, noting the progression of emotions that played across their features. Initial confusion gave way to surprise, then discomfort, then something approaching shock as they realized the extent of my awareness of their motivations and manipulations. The letter was comprehensive and unforgiving. I detailed every conversation, every pressure tactic, every moment when they'd prioritized their own convenience over my autonomy. I'd calculated the financial benefits they would derive from my move to institutional care, and contrasted them with the emotional and psychological costs I was being asked to bear. I'd described my growing understanding that their concern for my safety was largely performative, designed to justify decisions that served their interests rather than mine. But the most devastating part of the letter was my documentation of all the ways they'd failed me as adult children, the visits that grew shorter and less frequent over the years, the phone calls that felt obligatory rather than genuine, the increasing tendency to discuss me with each other rather than talk to me directly about my needs and preferences. When they finished reading, the silence in the room was deafening. Patty was crying quietly, though whether from guilt or anger wasn't immediately clear. Bobby's face had gone pale, and his jaw was set in the stubborn expression I remembered from his teenage years when he'd been caught in some misbehavior. "This is incredibly unfair, Mom," he said finally. "We've done everything we could to help you, and this is how you repay us? With accusations and conspiracy theories?" "Which part is unfair?" I asked calmly. "The part where I point out that selling my house and moving me into institutional care increases your inheritance by approximately $300,000. Or the part where I note that your visits decreased by 70% after your father died?" "We've been busy," Patty said defensively, wiping her eyes. "Between work and our own families, it's hard to find time for social visits." "Social visits," I repeated. "Is that what you call spending time with your widowed mother? Social visits?" "That's not what I meant. I think it's exactly what you meant. I think you've been viewing our relationship as a series of obligations, to be managed rather than a connection to be maintained. And when those obligations became inconvenient, you found a way to outsource them to paid professionals." Bobby stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "This is ridiculous. We're not going to sit here and be attacked for caring about your welfare." "Sit down, Bobby." My voice carried an authority I hadn't used since he was a child, and to my surprise, he obeyed. "You're going to sit here and listen to what I have to say, because this is probably the last honest conversation we're ever going to have." Something in my tone must have penetrated their defensiveness, because both of them grew very still. "I know why you wanted me in this place," I continued. "It wasn't about my safety or my social needs or my declining faculties. It was about removing the inconvenience of an aging parent from your lives while ensuring that my assets would be preserved for your inheritance." "That's not true," Patty protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it? Let's examine the timeline. Your concerns about my competence began shortly after your father's death, when it became clear that I'd be living alone in a house worth $400,000. Your suggestions about institutional care intensified after you learned about my retirement savings and life insurance policies. And your insistence on immediate action coincided perfectly with your discovery that good facilities have waiting lists." I pulled out a small notebook I'd been carrying and flipped it open. "I've done some calculations of my own. If I live another 10 years at Maplewood, the total cost will be approximately $600,000. That's money that won't be available for your inheritance. If I'd stayed in my house with hired help for grocery shopping and housekeeping, the annual cost would have been perhaps $20,000, leaving the bulk of my assets intact." Bobby and Patty stared at me, clearly stunned by the precision of my financial analysis. "You think we don't care about you as a person," Bobby said finally. "You think we only see dollar signs when we look at you? I think you've convinced yourselves that what's financially beneficial for you is also what's best for me. It's a convenient form of self-deception that allows you to feel virtuous while acting selfishly. We were genuinely worried about you. Living alone," Patty insisted. "Your memory lapses, your confusion, the incident with Mrs. Thompson." "My memory lapses consisted of forgetting Tommy's birthday once and getting lost coming home from the grocery store during construction. Hardly evidence of dementia. My confusion was actually grief, which is a normal response to losing a spouse of 46 years. And the incident with Mrs. Thompson was her misinterpretation of my investigation of strange noises in my yard." I closed the notebook and looked directly at both of them. But even if those incidents had been signs of cognitive decline, the appropriate response would have been to increase support, not to decrease autonomy. You chose the most drastic intervention because it served your purposes, not because it served mine. "So what do you want from us?" Bobby asked, his voice tight with anger. "An apology? A confession that we're terrible children who only care about money?" "I want you to understand what you've done to me," I said simply. "I want you to acknowledge that this place, pleasant as it may be, is not my home and never will be. I want you to admit that you pressured me into a decision that benefits you more than it benefits me." "And then what?" Patty asked. "What happens after we acknowledge all of that?" "Then you help me leave." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Both Bobby and Patty stared at me as if I'd announced my intention to fly to the moon. "Leave." "And go where?" Bobby asked. "You've already sold your house. You've committed to this place. You can't just change your mind because you're having adjustment difficulties." "I can change my mind because it's my life and my money and my decision to make." "Mom, be realistic," Patty said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd learned to hate. "Where would you live? How would you manage? You don't have the resources to start over at your age." "Don't I? Let's see. I have approximately $800,000 in combined assets, minus the $60,000 I've already spent on Maplewood. That leaves $740,000. A modest apartment would cost perhaps $800 a month. Hired help for shopping and housework might cost another $400. Even with inflation and unexpected expenses, I could live independently for 20 years on that amount." I'd done my homework during the sleepless nights since my conversation with Margaret. I'd researched housing options, calculated costs, and explored alternatives that no one had bothered to present to me during the rush to relocate me to institutional care. "But what about your safety?" Patty asked. "What if you fall? What if you have a medical emergency?" "The same things that could happen here, except I'd be in a place I chose rather than a place you chose for me, and I'd have the satisfaction of knowing I lived on my own terms until the end." Bobby stood up again, his frustration evident. "This is insane, Mom. You're talking about throwing away a situation that works for everyone just because you're feeling sorry for yourself." "A situation that works for everyone?" I repeated. "It works for you because you don't have to worry about visiting me or helping me or feeling guilty about neglecting me. It works for Patty because she knows I'm being supervised and cared for by people she's paying to do what she doesn't want to do herself. But it doesn't work for me, Bobby. It makes me miserable every single day." "You've only been here 9 days, Patty protested. "You need to give it more time. I've been here long enough to know that this isn't living. It's existing in a holding pattern until death, and I refuse to waste whatever time I have left in a place that feels like a prison, no matter how well appointed it might be." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the carefully maintained grounds that were supposed to compensate for the loss of freedom and autonomy. "When your father was dying," I said, my back still to them, "he made me promise him something. He made me promise that I wouldn't let anyone else control my life after he was gone. He said he'd spent his whole life watching women of our generation give up their independence to make other people comfortable, and he didn't want that to happen to me." I turned around to face them. "I broke that promise when I let you talk me into coming here, but I'm not going to keep breaking it just because admitting my mistake is inconvenient for you." The room fell silent except for the sound of Patty's quiet crying and the muffled holiday festivities taking place elsewhere in the building. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" Bobby asked finally. "I'm asking you to help me find a place to live that allows me to maintain my independence while addressing your legitimate concerns about my safety. I'm asking you to support my decision to leave Maplewood, even if you don't agree with it. And I'm asking you to treat me like a competent adult who has the right to make choices about her own life." "And if we say no?" Patty asked. "Then I'll do it without your help. I'll call a taxi tomorrow morning and check myself out of here. I'll find my own apartment and hire my own help and live my own life. The only difference is that you'll have lost any opportunity to be part of that life." It wasn't an idle threat. I'd already researched the procedures for leaving Maplewood and found that while there were financial penalties for breaking the contract, there were no legal barriers to simply walking away. Bobby and Patty exchanged another look, and I could see them weighing their options. They could continue to insist that I was making a mistake and risk losing any influence over my decisions, or they could accept my determination to leave and try to maintain some control over the process. "If we help you," Bobby said slowly, "if we support this decision, what guarantee do we have that you won't change your mind again in 6 months and blame us for letting you make another mistake?" "None," I said honestly. "But that's what it means to respect someone's autonomy. You accept that they have the right to make their own mistakes and live with the consequences." "And what about the money you've already spent here? The deposit, the first month's fees? Consider it tuition for a valuable lesson about the importance of making my own decisions." Patty wiped her eyes and looked up at me. "You really hate it here that much?" "I hate feeling like I'm already dead," I said. "I hate having every aspect of my daily life controlled by other people's schedules and preferences. I hate being around people who are just waiting to die instead of people who are still trying to live." "But Mom, you could die alone in an apartment. You could fall and lie there for days before anyone found you." "That's true. But I could also live alone in an apartment. I could wake up each morning and decide what I want to do with my day. I could cook my own meals and keep my own schedule, and maintain relationships with people who see me as a person rather than a problem to be managed." I sat back down across from them. "Patty, when you're my age, would you rather die in your own home having lived according to your own values? Or would you rather die safely in an institution where other people made all your decisions for you?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I'd rather die at home." "Then help me go home. Not to the house we sold, but to a life that feels like mine again." Bobby was still resistant. "This is going to be complicated. We'll have to find you a place to live, arrange for services, set up support systems. And what if it doesn't work out? What if you can't manage as well as you think you can? Then we'll figure out alternatives when that happens, but at least I'll have had the chance to try." "And what about our relationship?" Patty asked. "After everything that's been said here today, where do we go from here?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been thinking about since deciding to reveal the contents of my letter. "That depends on you," I said. "If you can accept that I'm an adult who deserves to be treated with respect and consulted about decisions that affect my life, then we can rebuild our relationship on a healthier foundation. If you continue to see me as a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be loved, then our relationship will probably continue to deteriorate." "We do love you, Mom," Patty said, her voice breaking. "I know you do, but love isn't just a feeling. It's also a way of behaving. And the way you've been behaving toward me doesn't feel like love. It feels like management." Bobby stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "If we do this, if we help you leave here and find your own place, there have to be conditions." "What kind of conditions?" "Regular check-ins, medical monitoring, emergency response systems. We're not going to help you set up a situation where you could be in danger without anyone knowing. Those sound like reasonable safety measures rather than restrictions on my autonomy," I said. "I'm willing to discuss them." "And if your health deteriorates significantly, if you reach a point where independent living really isn't safe anymore, you have to agree to consider other options." "I'll agree to that, as long as I'm part of the decision-making process and my preferences are given genuine consideration." Patty joined Bobby at the window, and they spoke in low voices for several minutes. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language suggested they were debating whether to support my decision or continue trying to convince me to stay at Maplewood. Finally, they returned to their seats. "All right," Bobby said reluctantly. We'll help you. But this is against our better judgment. And if something bad happens, we're going to remind you that we warned you. Noted, I said dryly. And we want to be involved in finding your new place and setting up support services. We're not just going to turn you loose to figure everything out on your own. I'd appreciate your help, as long as you remember that the final decisions are mine to make. Patty reached over and took my hand. Mom, I want you to know that everything we did because we were scared. Scared of something happening to you. Scared of not being good enough children. Scared of losing you the way we lost Dad. I understand that, I said, squeezing her hand. But fear isn't a good basis for making major life decisions, and it's certainly not a good excuse for ignoring someone else's clearly expressed preferences. We'll do better, Bobby said, though he still looked skeptical about my decision to leave Maplewood. I hope so. Because this is probably our last chance to get our relationship right. We spent the next hour making practical plans. Bobby would start looking for suitable apartments in safe neighborhoods with good access to medical care and shopping. Patty would research home care services and emergency response systems. I would handle the paperwork for leaving Maplewood and manage the financial aspects of the transition. By the time we joined the rest of the family for Christmas dinner in the main dining room, the crisis had passed, though the underlying tensions remained unresolved. Katie asked why I looked like I'd been crying, and Tommy wanted to know if I was sick. I assured them both that I was fine, just having an emotional day because of missing their grandfather. The institutional Christmas dinner was exactly as depressing as I'd anticipated. The food was adequate but impersonal. The decorations were cheerful but generic, and the atmosphere was filled with the forced joviality of people trying to make the best of a difficult situation. Families clustered around tables, making conversation with elderly relatives who looked diminished and somehow less themselves in the institutional setting. But for the first time since arriving at Maplewood, I felt hopeful. Not because the circumstances had suddenly improved, but because I'd reclaimed some measure of control over my life. I'd spoken the truth about my situation, demanded respect for my preferences, and secured my children's reluctant agreement to help me pursue the life I wanted, rather than the life they thought I should have. The letter I'd written as a final testament had become instead a declaration of independence. And for the first time in months, I felt like Dorothy Henderson again. Not a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed, but a woman with agency and dignity and the right to shape her own destiny. Part 4 continued. The aftermath. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a blur of activity that felt both surreal and energizing. For the first time since Frank's death, I had a project that excited me rather than simply tasks that needed to be completed for other people's peace of mind. Bobby, true to his word, had identified several apartment options within 3 days. Most were in senior-friendly complexes with elevators and emergency call systems. But unlike Maplewood, they were regular apartments where residents lived independently rather than according to institutional schedules. The apartment that caught my attention was in a converted historic building downtown, just 6 blocks from the library where I'd volunteered years earlier and within walking distance of several restaurants and shops. It had high ceilings, large windows, and enough space for my favorite furniture and books. Best of all, it felt like a place where someone lived rather than a place where someone was stored. Patty, meanwhile, had thrown herself into researching support services with the same efficiency she brought to her real estate career. She'd identified home health aides, grocery delivery services, housekeeping companies, and medical alert systems. Her thoroughness was impressive, though I suspected it was motivated as much by anxiety about my safety as by genuine desire to help. The most challenging aspect of the transition was dealing with Maplewood's administration. Mr. Franklin was clearly displeased by my decision to leave after only 2 weeks, though he tried to hide his disapproval behind professional courtesy. "I do hope you'll reconsider, Mrs. Henderson," he said during our exit interview. It's very common for new residents to experience some adjustment difficulties during their first month. With a little more time, I'm confident you would have found your place in our community. I'm sure I would have, I replied diplomatically. But I've decided I prefer to remain in the larger community for now. Of course, that's your choice, though I should mention that if you change your mind and want to return, we can't guarantee that an apartment will be available immediately. Our waiting list is quite long. The implicit threat was clear: leave now and risk not being able to return if independent living didn't work out. But the threat only strengthened my resolve. I was tired of making decisions based on fear of worst-case scenarios rather than hope for best-case outcomes. The financial penalties for breaking my contract with Maplewood were substantial, but not devastating. I forfeited the $5,000 deposit and had to pay an additional month's fees, bringing my total loss to nearly $10,000. Bobby winced when he learned the amount, but I pointed out that it was less than I would have spent on 2 months of care at the facility. On December 30th, I packed my belongings into boxes for the second time in 3 weeks. But this time, the packing felt like liberation rather than loss. I was moving towards something I wanted rather than away from something I feared. Mrs. Rodriguez came to say goodbye as I waited for the moving truck, her eyes bright with what looked like envy. "I wish I had your courage," she said, embracing me carefully. "I think about leaving here every day, but I don't know where I'd go or how I'd manage." "It's never too late to reconsider your options," I told her. "You have more choices than you think." "Maybe," she said wistfully. "But my children would never support a decision like yours. They'd think I'd lost my mind." "Then maybe it's time to stop asking for their support and start asking for their respect." The moving truck arrived at 10 in the morning, and by noon, I was standing in my new apartment surrounded by boxes and possibilities. The space felt enormous after my institutional room at Maplewood, and the silence was blissful after weeks of constant background noise from staff and other residents. Bobby and Patty had both taken the day off work to help with the move, and I was grateful for their assistance even though I could sense their ongoing anxiety about my decision. They fussed over the placement of furniture and the safety features of the building, clearly trying to convince themselves that they hadn't made a terrible mistake by supporting my independence. "The emergency call system is connected directly to the security desk," Patty explained for the 3rd time, showing me the pendant I was supposed to wear around my neck. "If you press it, someone will be here within minutes." "And the building manager lives on site," Bobby added. "She's very nice, and she said she'd be happy to check on you if we're ever worried." "I appreciate all the safety measures," I said, though I was beginning to feel smothered by their solicitude. "But remember, the point of this move was to give me more independence, not to recreate institutional oversight in a different setting." They both looked chastened, and I realized they were struggling to find the right balance between caring for me and controlling me. It would take time for all of us to adjust to a new dynamic in our relationship. That evening, after Bobby and Patty had left, and I'd unpacked enough boxes to make the apartment functional, I sat in my favorite chair by the large windows and looked out at the city lights. For the first time in months, I felt at peace with my surroundings and my choices. The next morning, New Year's Eve, I woke up naturally rather than to the sound of institutional breakfast preparations. I made coffee in my own kitchen, ate breakfast at my own pace, and spent the morning arranging my books on the built-in shelves that had attracted me to the apartment. Around noon, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Park, calling to check on my progress. "Dorothy, how you feeling in new place?" "Wonderful," I said, and meant it. "It's good to be home again, even if it's a different home." "Good for you. You show your children they not the boss of your life. I hope I showed them that I deserve to be treated with respect regardless of my age." "Same thing," Mrs. Park said pragmatically. "You want visitors today? I bring Korean soup. We celebrate New Year together." The invitation touched me more than I'd expected. "I'd love that, Evelyn. I haven't had Korean soup in years." I come this afternoon. You give me address. After we hung up, I realized that Mrs. Park would be my first guest in my new home. My first step toward rebuilding a social life based on mutual enjoyment rather than family obligation or institutional programming. The afternoon passed pleasantly as Mrs. Park and I shared soup and conversation in my sunny living room. She admired my book collection and told me stories about her late husband that I'd never heard during our years as neighbors. For the first time since Frank's death, I felt like I was having a real friendship with someone who saw me as an interesting person rather than a problem to be managed. As evening approached and Mrs. Park prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Dorothy, you want advice from old woman who made many mistakes?" "Always. Don't forgive your children too easy. They need to learn that treating you bad has consequences. If you forgive too quick, they think they can do same thing again." Her words stayed with me as I prepared for my first night alone in my new apartment. Bobby and Patty had both called to check on me, their voices carrying a mixture of concern and guilt that suggested they were still processing the revelations from Christmas Day. I understood that rebuilding trust and respect in our relationship would take time and consistent effort from all of us. But for the first time in months, I felt optimistic about the possibility of having genuine relationships with my adult children, rather than just managing their anxiety about my aging. That night, as I lay in my own bed in my own apartment listening to the familiar sounds of urban life outside my windows, I thought about the letter that had changed everything. The words I'd written in anger and desperation had become the catalyst for reclaiming my independence and self-respect. But more than that, they'd forced me to confront the truth about what I wanted from my remaining years. Not safety at the expense of autonomy, not convenience at the cost of dignity, but the opportunity to live authentically according to my own values until the very end. As midnight approached and fireworks began exploding over the city, I made my own quiet resolution for the new year. I would continue to be brave for myself, to speak the truth even when it was uncomfortable, and to insist on being treated with the respect I'd spent a lifetime earning. The goodbye note I'd written for Maplewood had become instead a hello note to the rest of my life, and I intended to make that life worth living, regardless of how many years I had left to enjoy it. 6 months after leaving Maplewood, I was sitting in the community garden behind my apartment building, pulling weeds from the small plot I'd claimed for growing tomatoes and herbs. The May sunshine was warm on my back, and my hands were pleasantly dirty from working in the soil, two sensations I'd forgotten I missed during my brief stay in institutional care. The garden had been one of the unexpected discoveries about my new neighborhood. When the building manager mentioned it during my initial tour, I'd dismissed it as something I wouldn't have time or energy to pursue. But as winter gave way to spring and I found myself with more autonomy over my daily schedule than I'd had in years, I'd decided to try my hand at growing things again. It had been nearly 40 years since I'd maintained a vegetable garden, back when Bobby and Patty were young, and I'd grown produce to supplement our grocery budget. Frank had built raised beds in our backyard, and I'd spent countless summer evenings tending plants while he pushed the children on their swings. The memory of those peaceful hours had drawn me to claim a small section of the community space, and I'd been surprised by how quickly my confidence with plants returned. The other gardeners were a diverse group, young professionals who grew herbs for cooking, retirees like myself who enjoyed the physical activity and social interaction, and families with children who treated the garden as both education and entertainment. It was exactly the kind of intergenerational community that I'd been told I needed institutional care to find, except it had formed naturally around shared interests rather than shared circumstances. My relationship with Bobby and Patty had evolved considerably since our confrontation at Maplewood, though not always in the directions I'd expected. The initial period of guilt and overcompensation had given way to something more complex, a cautious rebuilding of trust that involved all of us learning new ways of relating to each other. Bobby had been the slower of the two to adjust to my independence. His visits to my apartment were frequent but brief, and I could see him cataloging potential safety hazards and signs of decline with every glance around my living space. He meant, well, but his anxiety about my well-being sometimes made conversations feel like medical examinations rather than family visits. The breakthrough in our relationship had come 3 months after my move, when I'd slipped in my bathroom and bruised my ribs. I'd managed the injury on my own, calling my doctor, arranging for x-rays, following up with appropriate care. But when Bobby learned about the incident after the fact, his reaction had been explosive. "This is exactly what we were worried about," he'd said, pacing my living room like a caged animal. "You could have broken bones. You could have hit your head. You could have been lying there for hours before anyone found you." "But none of those things happened," I'd pointed out calmly. "I fell, I got hurt, I took care of myself, and I'm fine now. This is what competent adults do when they have minor accidents. Minor accidents can become major tragedies when you're living alone at your age." "Bobby, sit down." I'd used the same authoritative tone that had worked during our Christmas confrontation, and again he'd complied. "We need to talk about what happened here, because it's not actually about my fall." "Of course it's about your fall. You're hurt, you're alone, and you didn't even tell us what happened until 3 days later." "I'm hurt in exactly the same way I would have been hurt if I'd fallen at Maplewood or in your house or anywhere else. The location of my fall didn't determine its severity, and I didn't tell you immediately because it wasn't an emergency that required your intervention." Bobby had stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "But what if it had been an emergency? What if you'd needed help?" "Then I would have called for help. I have a phone, I have neighbors, I have medical alert systems. I'm not helpless just because I'm not living in an institution. You're also not invincible just because you're living independently." His observation had been fair, and it had forced me to confront my own tendency to overcompensate for months of being treated as incompetent by being unnecessarily secretive about normal challenges. "You're right," I'd admitted. "I should have told you about the fall sooner, not because I needed your help managing it, but because people who care about each other share information about significant events in their lives." "So how do we do this?" Bobby had asked, his frustration giving way to genuine confusion. "How do we find the balance between caring about you and smothering you?" It had been a crucial question, and one that had required honest communication from both of us about our needs and boundaries. Over the following weeks, we'd worked out a system where I kept Bobby and Patty informed about health issues and household problems without asking their permission to handle my own affairs. In return, they offered support and assistance without trying to take over decision-making. The arrangement wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when Bobby's protectiveness felt controlling, or when my independence looked like stubbornness. But we were both making an effort to respect each other's perspectives, and our conversations had become more honest and less performative. Patty's adjustment had been different but equally complex. Her initial response to my move had been to become hypervigilant about my social and emotional well-being, calling multiple times per week to check on my mood and suggesting activities she thought I should pursue. "Have you considered joining the senior center?" she'd asked during one of our phone conversations. "They have book clubs and exercise classes and social events." "I have considered it," I'd replied patiently. "And I've decided it's not for me right now." "But Mom, you need social interaction. You can't just sit in your apartment reading all day." "Why can't I? If reading all day makes me happy, what's wrong with that?" Patty had struggled to answer that question, eventually admitting that her concern was less about my happiness than about her image of what constituted a proper retirement lifestyle. "I guess I worry that people will think we're neglecting you if you're not participating in organized activities. And I worry that you're more concerned about what other people think than about what I want." It had been a harsh observation, but a necessary one. Like Bobby, Patty had needed to learn the difference between caring for me and managing me, between supporting my choices and making choices for me. The process had been gradual and sometimes frustrating for all of us. But by spring, we'd settled into a routine that honored both my independence and their concern for my welfare. Bobby visited every 2 weeks for dinner, during which we discussed practical matters and caught up on family news. Patty called once a week for longer conversations about books, current events, and her work. Both of them included me and family, gatherings and holiday celebrations, but they no longer assumed I would automatically conform to their schedules and preferences. Most importantly, they'd stopped treating my living situation as a temporary arrangement that would inevitably need to be replaced with institutional care. My competence was no longer constantly under evaluation, and my autonomy was no longer contingent on perfect health and flawless decision-making. The changes in our relationship had been liberating for me, but they'd also revealed how much energy I'd been spending over the years trying to manage my children's anxiety about my aging. Without that constant emotional labor, I'd found myself with time and mental space to pursue interests I'd neglected during my years of widowhood and family crisis. The community garden was just one example. I'd also returned to volunteering. At the library, joined a book discussion group that met at a local cafe, and begun taking watercolor classes at the community college. None of these activities were particularly ambitious or remarkable, but they represented something I'd thought I'd lost forever: the ability to choose how to spend my time based on curiosity and enjoyment rather than obligation and others' expectations. The watercolor classes had been particularly meaningful. I'd always been interested in art, but had never had the time or confidence to pursue it seriously. Now, at 76, I was finally learning to mix colors and understand perspective and capture light on paper. My paintings were amateur efforts that would never hang in galleries, but they brought me a satisfaction I hadn't felt since before Frank's illness. My instructor, a woman in her 40s named Sarah Chen, treated all her students with the same respect and encouragement regardless of their age or skill level. When I'd mentioned during our first class that I was worried about being too old to learn new techniques, she'd looked genuinely puzzled. "Age only affects your ability to learn if you let it," she'd said. "Some of my most dedicated students are in their 70s and 80s. They bring a patience and perspective to art that younger students often lack." Her words had reminded me of something I'd forgotten during the crisis that led to my brief stay at Maplewood: that growing older didn't necessarily mean growing less capable or less interesting. It meant having the accumulated wisdom and experience to approach new challenges with confidence rather than anxiety. The book discussion group had provided a different kind of intellectual stimulation. Unlike the superficial book club at Maplewood, this group tackled challenging contemporary fiction and engaged in sophisticated analysis of themes, characters, and literary techniques. The discussions were led by a retired English professor named James Martinez, and the participants ranged in age from 30 to 80. During one particularly lively discussion about a novel that dealt with family dysfunction and generational trauma, I'd found myself sharing insights drawn from my own experience with Bobby and Patty. The group had listened with genuine interest, and several members had commented afterward that my perspective had enhanced their understanding of the book's themes. It had been years since anyone had valued my intellectual contributions or treated my life experience as a source of wisdom rather than evidence of obsolescence. The feeling of being seen and heard as a thinking person rather than just an aging body had been profoundly restorative. Perhaps most surprisingly, I'd also begun dating, something I'd never imagined would be part of my post-Frank life. Richard Walsh was a 78-year-old widower I'd met in the book discussion group, a retired physician with a gentle manner and a dry sense of humor that reminded me of Frank in some ways while being distinctly his own. Our first coffee date had happened almost by accident. We'd both arrived early for book club one evening and had fallen into conversation about the novel we were reading. The discussion had continued after the group ended, and when Richard suggested we continue over coffee the following week, I'd agreed without thinking too hard about the implications. Coffee had led to dinner, which had led to movies and concerts and long walks through the city's historic district. Richard was intelligent and considerate, and he treated me like an interesting woman rather than a fragile elderly person who needed careful handling. When I'd mentioned Richard to Bobby and Patty, their reactions had been telling. Bobby had immediately asked about Richard's financial situation and health status, as if I were incapable of evaluating those factors myself. Patty had wondered aloud whether it was appropriate for people our age to be dating, as if romance expired at some predetermined point in the aging process. "I'm not asking for your approval," I'd told them both. "I'm sharing information about my life because that's what families do." "But Mom," Patty had protested, "don't you think you should be careful about getting involved with someone at this stage of your life?" Careful about what? About being happy? About having companionship? About feeling attractive and valued? Neither of them had been able to answer that question satisfactorily, and eventually they'd both grudgingly accepted Richard's presence in my life. Bobby had even admitted, after meeting Richard at a family barbecue, that he seemed like a decent guy, which was high praise coming from my suspicious son. Richard and I weren't rushing toward marriage or dramatic life changes. We were simply enjoying each other's company and seeing where the relationship might lead. At our ages, we both understood that time was finite and that waiting for perfect circumstances was a luxury we couldn't afford. The transformation in my daily life had been accompanied by changes in how I thought about my remaining years. Instead of viewing each day as a step closer to inevitable decline and death, I'd begun to see my time as an opportunity to experience things I'd never made room for during my busy decades of marriage and child-rearing. I kept a journal now, something I'd never done consistently before. The daily practice of reflecting on my experiences and recording my thoughts had helped me appreciate the richness of my current life, in ways I'd never bothered to do when I was younger and assumed I had unlimited time ahead of me. One evening in late May, as I was writing in my journal on the small balcony of my apartment, Patty called with news that brought our family's evolution full circle. "Mom, I have something to tell you, and I'm not sure how you're going to react." Her tone was cautious, the way it had been during the months following my departure from Maplewood when she was still afraid of triggering another confrontation. "What is it, sweetheart?" "David's mother is having some health problems, and his siblings think she shouldn't be living alone anymore. They want her to move to a senior living community, and they've asked for our advice about how to handle the situation." I understood immediately why Patty was nervous about sharing this information. 6 months earlier, she and Bobby had been the children pressuring an aging parent into institutional care, convinced they were acting in my best interests. Now she was being asked to help other adult children navigate the same decisions. "What did you tell them?" I told them they needed to involve her in the decision-making process from the beginning. I said they shouldn't assume that what seemed most convenient for them would necessarily be best for her. That sounds like wise advice. I also told them about our experience with you, how we made the mistake of prioritizing our own peace of mind over your autonomy and how much damage that did to our relationship. Patty's voice carried a note of shame that I'd heard periodically since Christmas, an acknowledgement of guilt that I'd stopped trying to assuage. She and Bobby needed to sit with the consequences of their actions, just as I'd needed to sit with the consequences of allowing myself to be manipulated. How did they respond to that? They were surprised. I think they assumed that because you were living independently now, everything had worked out fine and there hadn't been any real problems with our approach. But you told them differently? I told them that we'd almost lost you completely. That if you hadn't been strong enough to stand up for yourself, we would have destroyed our relationship with you while convincing ourselves we were being good children. The admission cost Patty something to make, and I appreciated her willingness to be honest about the damage our family had sustained. "I'm proud of you for sharing that perspective," I said. "It can't have been easy to admit those mistakes to people who might judge you for them." "I don't care if they judge me. I care about not letting another family make the same errors we made." Her response revealed how much our confrontation at Maplewood had changed her understanding of filial responsibility. She'd learned that, Being a good adult child meant supporting her parents' autonomy rather than managing her parents' circumstances. How is David's mother handling the pressure? She's resisting, just like you did, and her children are getting frustrated, just like we did. But I think our conversation helped them understand that resistance isn't necessarily a sign of confusion or stubbornness. Sometimes it's a sign that someone knows what's best for themselves. After we hung up, I reflected on how dramatically my family's dynamics had shifted in less than a year. The crisis that had nearly destroyed our relationships had ultimately made them stronger and more honest. Bobby and Patty had been forced to confront their own motivations and assumptions, while I'd been forced to advocate for myself in ways I'd never done before. The process had been painful for all of us, but it had also been necessary. Without the confrontation at Maplewood, we would have continued our slow drift toward the kind of superficial, management-based relationship that characterized too many families dealing with aging parents. Instead, we'd found our way to something more authentic, relationships based on mutual respect rather than protective control, honest communication rather than careful management of each other's feelings. That night, as I prepared for bed in my own apartment surrounded by my own possessions and my own choices, I thought about the letter that had catalyzed these changes. The words I'd written in anger and desperation had become the foundation for rebuilding my life according to my own values and preferences. But more than that, they'd reminded me of something I'd forgotten during the difficult months after Frank's death. That I was still Dorothy Henderson, still a woman with agency and intelligence and the right to shape her own destiny. Age hadn't eliminated those qualities. Fear and other people's anxieties had simply obscured them. The goodbye note I'd written for my children had become instead a hello note to myself, a recognition that my life wasn't over just because I was alone, that my value wasn't diminished just because I was aging, that my future wasn't predetermined just because my past had included loss and disappointment. As I drifted off to sleep in my own bed in my own home, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Frank's illness began. Genuine excitement about what tomorrow might bring. Not because I expected dramatic adventures or miraculous transformations, but because I knew that whatever happened, I would face it as myself, making my own choices and living by my own standards. The special something I'd left for my children in that goodbye note hadn't been revenge or guilt or punishment. It had been the truth, about their motivations, about my feelings, and about what I deserved from the people who claimed to love me. And the truth, as difficult as it had been to hear and accept, had set all of us free. 2 years had passed since I'd walked out of Maplewood Care Center, and I was standing in the kitchen of my apartment preparing Thanksgiving dinner for my family. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was cooking a full holiday meal at 78 when my children had once believed I was too incompetent to manage my own breakfast. The turkey was golden in the oven, the sweet potatoes were mashed and waiting to be reheated, and the dining room table was set with the good china I'd retrieved from storage after settling into my new home. Richard was arriving at 2 o'clock, with his famous cornbread stuffing, and Bobby and Patty would be here with their families at 3. For the first time in years, I was genuinely looking forward to a family gathering. My relationship with Richard had deepened into something neither of us had expected when we'd started having coffee together 2 years ago. We'd moved beyond casual dating into a comfortable partnership that enriched both our lives without overwhelming them. He kept his apartment across town, and I maintained my independence, but we spent most evenings together and had become each other's primary companions. Richard's approach to my autonomy had been refreshingly different from my children's initial response. He offered assistance when I asked for it and respected my decisions even when he disagreed with them. When I'd mentioned wanting to take a pottery class, he'd helped me research options rather than questioning whether it was appropriate for someone my age. When I'd decided to adopt a cat from the local shelter, he'd gone with me to choose one, rather than listing reasons why pet ownership might be inadvisable. The cat in question, a orange tabby named Fitzgerald, was currently supervising my cooking from his perch on the kitchen counter. I'd named him after my favorite author, and he'd proven to be excellent company during the quiet hours when I was reading or writing in my journal. His presence had added a warmth to my apartment that I hadn't realized was missing. Richard arrived precisely at 2, as was his habit, carrying a casserole dish and wearing the navy sweater I'd given him for his birthday. We'd fallen into comfortable domestic routines over the past year without making formal commitments about our future. At our ages, we both understood that the future was unpredictable and that forcing definitions onto our relationship might diminish rather than enhance it. "Everything smells wonderful," he said, kissing my cheek before setting his contribution on the counter. "How can I help?" "You can open the wine and tell me whether the gravy needs more seasoning," I replied, handing him a spoon for tasting. We worked together efficiently, the kind of wordless cooperation that develops between people who've learned each other's rhythms and preferences. Richard had been married for 45 years before his wife's death from cancer, and he brought to our relationship the comfortable intimacy of someone who understood the value of partnership without the need for constant romance or drama. Bobby and Patty arrived together at 3:15, along with their spouses and children. The dynamics of these family gatherings had evolved considerably over the past 2 years, becoming more relaxed and genuine as we'd all learned to navigate our redefined relationships. "Mom, this place looks amazing," Patty said, admiring the table setting and the autumn decorations I'd arranged throughout the apartment. "You've really made this feel like home." "It is home," I replied simply. Perhaps not the home I expected to have at this stage of my life, but definitely the home I've chosen. Bobby was quieter during his initial survey of my preparations, but I caught him nodding approvingly at the efficient organization of my kitchen and the evidence of my continued competence. His journey toward accepting my independence had been slower than Patty's, but he'd finally stopped looking for signs of decline every time he visited. "Richard, good to see you," Bobby said, shaking hands with a warmth that would have been unimaginable during their first meeting. "How's the volunteer work going?" Richard had begun volunteering at a literacy program for adults, something he'd never had time for during his medical practice. His stories about his students had become a regular feature of our dinner conversations, and I'd been proud to see Bobby and Patty gradually recognize him as an interesting person in his own right, rather than just an accessory to my unexpected late-life romance. "Very rewarding," Richard replied. "I'm working with a woman in her 50s who's learning to read so she can help her grandson with his homework. Her determination is extraordinary." Katie, now 9 years old, had become fascinated by Richard's medical background and peppered him with questions about human anatomy during every family gathering. Tommy, at 18 and preparing for college, treated Richard with the casual acceptance of someone who'd never known a time when he wasn't part of our family constellation. As we settled around the dining table, I felt a satisfaction that went beyond successful meal preparation or pleasant company. This gathering represented something I'd fought hard to achieve, a family dinner where I was treated as the matriarch, rather than the patient, where my choices were respected rather than managed, where my happiness was considered as important as everyone else's comfort. "Before we eat," Patty said, "I'd like to say something." The table grew quiet, and I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Public declarations from my children still made me nervous, though the content had changed dramatically since our confrontation at Maplewood. 2 years ago, we almost lost Mom because we thought we knew what was best for her better than she knew herself, Patty continued, her voice steady but emotional. "We've all learned a lot since then about the difference between caring for someone and controlling them." Bobby nodded, picking up the thread of her observation. "Mom, I know we've talked about this before, but I want to say again how sorry I am for not listening to you during that whole Maplewood situation. You were right to fight for what you wanted, and we were wrong to pressure you into something. That made you miserable." Their apologies still moved me, even though we'd covered this ground multiple times over the past 2 years. The willingness to acknowledge their mistakes and learn from them had been crucial to rebuilding trust between us. I appreciate that, I said. But I also want to acknowledge that standing up for myself was something I should have learned to do much earlier in my life. The crisis around Maplewood wasn't just about your behavior, it was also about my own tendency to defer to other people's judgment instead of trusting my own instincts. David, Patty's husband, raised his wine glass. To Dorothy, for teaching all of us that age doesn't mean giving up the right to make your own decisions. And to learning that family means supporting each other's choices, not making choices. For each other, Richard added. As we began passing dishes around the table, the conversation turned to lighter topics. Tommy's college plans, Katie's school play, Bobby's recent promotion at work. But underneath the casual family chatter, I sensed a deeper appreciation for the fact that we were all here together, that our relationships had survived the crisis that had nearly destroyed them. During dessert, Katie asked a question that caught me off guard. "Grandma, are you happier now than you were when you lived in that nursing home place?" The adults around the table grew quiet, and I could see Bobby and Patty exchanging glances. Even 2 years later, the subject of Maplewood remained somewhat sensitive. "Much happier," I said honestly. Not because there was anything wrong with the people at Maplewood, but because this life feels like mine in a way that living there never did. "What do you mean it feels like yours?" Katie's curiosity was genuine, and I realized this might be an opportunity to help her understand something important about autonomy and self-determination. "Well, when I lived at Maplewood, other people decided when I should eat, what activities I should participate in, and how I should spend my days. Here, I get to make those decisions for myself." "But don't you get lonely living by yourself?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I've learned that being alone isn't the same thing as being lonely. I have friends, I have Richard, I have all of you. And I have activities that I enjoy and that make me feel useful." "Like what?" "Like my art classes and my book club and my volunteer work at the library. And like taking care of Fitzgerald and growing vegetables in the community garden." Katie absorbed this information with the serious attention she brought to all adult conversations. "So you're happier because you get to choose what you want to do?" "Exactly. Getting older doesn't mean you stop being able to make good decisions about your own life. It just means some people start thinking it does." Tommy, who'd been listening to our conversation while scrolling through his phone, suddenly looked up. "Is that why you wrote that letter? The one that made everyone upset?" The question surprised me, both because Tommy rarely engaged with family history and because I hadn't realized he knew about the letter that had precipitated our Christmas confrontation at Maplewood. "How do you know about the letter?" "I heard Mom and Dad talking about it when they were trying to decide whether to help you move out of that place. They said you'd written down all the things you couldn't say while you were trying to be nice." His summary was surprisingly accurate for someone who'd been 16 at the time, and presumably focused on his own concerns rather than family drama. "That's essentially correct," I said. "Sometimes the only way to get people to listen to you is to stop being polite about things that are important to you." "What kinds of things?" Bobby and Patty were looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of this conversation, but I decided that Tommy was old enough to hear an honest answer. "Things like being treated with respect, being included in decisions that affect your life, and being trusted to know what makes you happy." "Did it work? Writing the letter instead of just telling them?" "It worked because it forced everyone to confront truths we'd all been avoiding. Your parents had to face the fact that they'd been making decisions based on what was convenient for them rather than what was best for me, and I had to face the fact that I'd been allowing them to do that because I was afraid of conflict." Richard squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture of support that I appreciated. These conversations about family history were still emotionally charged, even though they'd become more honest and productive over time. "So now you write down your feelings instead of keeping them secret?" Katie asked. Now I say what I think when I think it, rather than waiting until I'm too angry or hurt to be diplomatic about it, I clarified. It's much better for everyone involved. After dinner, as Bobby and Richard loaded the dishwasher and Patty helped me put away leftovers, my daughter brought up a subject that had been on my mind as well. Mom, have you given any thought to what you want us to do if your health starts to decline significantly? I mean, we're all hoping that's many years away, but we should probably have some kind of plan. The question was delicate but necessary. At 78, I was in remarkably good health, but I wasn't naive about the realities of aging. Eventually, I would likely face limitations that would require adjustments to my living situation. I've thought about it quite a bit, actually, I said. And I've done some research into options that would allow me to maintain as much independence as possible for as long as possible. What kinds of options? Home health care, adult day programs, modifications to make this apartment more accessible if mobility becomes an issue. There are lots of services available that could help me continue living here, even if I needed more assistance with daily activities. Patty nodded, though I could see her mental wheels turning. And if those options weren't sufficient? If you needed more care than could be provided at home? Then we'd explore assisted living facilities that offer more support while still allowing residents to make their own decisions about how they spend their time. The key difference would be that I'd be involved in choosing the place and the timing, rather than having those decisions made for me during a crisis. That sounds reasonable, Patty said. And it sounds like you've really thought it through. I have. Because I never want to be in the position again of having major life changes imposed on me by people who think they know what's best for me better than I do. Bobby joined our conversation as he finished cleaning the kitchen. What about a living will? Have you updated your medical directives since Dad died? I have, and I've made copies for both of you. I've also designated Richard as my healthcare proxy if neither of you is available during a medical emergency. This news surprised both my children, though they tried to hide their reactions. I could see them processing the implications of my decision to give medical decision-making authority to someone who wasn't family. Is that because you don't trust us to make good decisions? Bobby asked, his voice carefully neutral. It's because Richard has demonstrated consistently that he respects my autonomy and my judgment, even when he disagrees with my choices. And because he's had medical training and experience that might be helpful in complex healthcare situations. The explanation was diplomatic but honest. While my relationship with Bobby and Patty had improved dramatically, I still remembered their willingness to override my preferences when they'd been convinced they were acting in my best interests. That makes sense, Patty said after a moment. And I appreciate that you've thought ahead about these issues instead of leaving us to guess what you'd want. I learned from watching your father's illness that end-of-life decisions are much easier for everyone involved when the person's wishes are clearly documented and communicated ahead of time. As the evening wound down and families began gathering coats and preparing to leave, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from time well spent with people you love. The holiday had been everything I'd hoped, relaxed, genuine, and free from the undercurrents of tension that had characterized family gatherings during the years when my autonomy was constantly under evaluation. Tommy approached me as the others were saying their goodbyes. Grandma, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you proud of yourself for standing up to Mom and Dad about the nursing home thing? The question was more sophisticated than I'd expected from an 18-year-old, and it made me consider aspects of my experience that I hadn't examined from that particular angle. I'm proud of myself for finally learning to advocate for what I wanted rather than just accepting what other people thought I should want, I said. It took me 76 years to figure that out, which is probably longer than it should have taken. But you did figure it out. That's pretty cool. His approval meant more to me than I'd anticipated. Tommy represented the next generation of our family, and his understanding of the importance of self-advocacy would hopefully serve him well in his own life. After everyone left, Richard and I settled on my couch with cups of tea and slices of leftover pie. Fitzgerald curled up between us, purring contentedly as we reflected on the evening. "That went well," Richard observed. "Your family has come a long way in the past 2 years." "We all have," I agreed. "Though I think the most important change has been my willingness to insist on being treated with respect rather than just hoping it would happen eventually." "Do you ever regret the confrontation at Maplewood? Wonder if there might have been a gentler way to address the situation?" It was a question I'd asked myself many times, particularly during the difficult months, when my relationships with Bobby and Patty had been strained and uncertain. "I regret that it was necessary," I said slowly. "I regret that our family had to go through such a painful crisis before we could learn to communicate honestly with each other. But I don't regret standing up for myself, even though it was difficult and frightening at the time." What would you say to other people who find themselves in similar situations? Older adults whose families are pressuring them to make changes they don't want to make. Richard's question made me think about Mrs. Rodriguez at Maplewood, about Mrs. Park's advice to be brave for myself, about all the older adults who might be facing similar challenges with well-meaning but controlling family members. I'd say that being accommodating and avoiding conflict might feel easier in the short term, but it leads to resentment and loss of self-respect in the long term. I'd tell them that their preferences and feelings matter, regardless of their age. And I'd remind them that accepting help doesn't mean giving up the right to make their own decisions. And to the adult children, I'd tell them to listen more and manage less, to ask what their parent wants before telling them what they need, to remember that competence isn't eliminated by aging, and that making mistakes is a fundamental human right that doesn't expire when you turn 70 or 80. As we prepared for bed, I thought about the letter that had started this transformation in my life. The words I'd written in anger and desperation had become the catalyst for reclaiming my sense of self and rebuilding my relationships on a foundation of mutual respect rather than protective control. But more than that, they'd reminded me that it's never too late to become the person you want to be, to insist on the life you want to live, to refuse to accept limitations that serve other people's comfort rather than your own well-being. The goodbye note I'd written for Maplewood had become instead a hello note to the rest of my life, a life filled with choices and challenges and companionship and growth. At 78, I was more authentically myself than I'd been in years, more confident in my judgment, more willing to take risks for the sake of happiness rather than security. As I drifted off to sleep in my own bed beside the man I'd chosen to love, in the home I'd chosen to create, surrounded by the life I'd fought to build, I felt something I'd almost forgotten was possible. Genuine excitement about tomorrow and all the tomorrows that might follow. The special something I'd left for my children in that goodbye note hadn't been punishment or revenge. It had been the gift of truth, about their behavior, about my needs, and about what all of us deserved from the people who claimed to love us. And that truth, difficult as it had been to hear and accept, had set all of us free to love each other, more honestly and completely than we'd ever managed before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.